Another one of the series of what we call Judaism and American law, or the Talmud and American law. Now today's topic we're going to be discussing is called Dina de Malchusa Dina. The law of the land is law. And what does that basically mean? That means that Jews not living in the land of Israel, because if you look at the Bible was written for Jews to live in Israel, to be governed by Jews, by the Torah, and every aspect of their life is governed by this book. But now Jews find themselves outside of Israel. We find ourselves in what we call the diaspora, or in exile. And how do we relate to a government that is not run according to the precepts of the Torah? I mean, whether it's an American government, or it's a European government, or it's a Muslim government, or any other government, how do we as Jews who are dedicated to the laws of the Torah deal with now living in a foreign country? So the rabbis in the Talmud came up with a dictum that says, Dina de Malchusa Dina, that the law of the land is law. Now, that's very nice in principle. But when it comes down to actual practicality, we're going to see that not always is this true. That there are going to be some times that the law of the land is not going to be the law that we are going to follow. And hopefully tonight, we'll talk about several instances and several questions that come up, and we'll try to deal with them through the eyes of what Judaism looks at within a foreign government. Now, I want to first talk about the historical aspect of this rule. This law basically came into existence around the years of 225 to 250 CE of the Common Era. It was brought down and primarily introduced to us by one of the great authors of the Talmud called Shmuel. Those days they didn't have any titles, no Rabbi Shmuel or Reb Shmuel or Mr. Shmuel, just Shmuel. That was his name, and in the Talmud, throughout the entire Talmud, that's all he's referred to as Shmuel. That's it. And he, in the Tractate of Gittin, in a tractate that deals with the laws of divorces, there's a case that comes up, and he says, Dina de Malchusa Dina, we rule like this because the law of the land is law. Now, why at that particular time and in that particular place? Because, as you know, in the year 70, the temple was destroyed, the second temple. The Jews were primarily moved out by the Romans to Babylon, where they had lived before. I mean, many Jews had lived in Babylon, and they migrated east to Babylon. After the second war that they had with Hadrian, and Hadrian really destroyed Jerusalem, there was almost no remnants of Jews living in Israel. Maybe some in small pockets, but primarily scholarship and the leadership of the Jewish people found itself in a place called Babylon. And they were ruled by a nation called the Parthians. Early in the 3rd century, the Persians overthrew the Parthians. They overthrew them. And the Jews now had to start dealing with what they called a centralized kind of government. It wasn't anymore like small little pockets of Jews were governed by different people. Now there was a centralized king, and he made the rules. And in the year 241, to be precise, CE, there arose a fellow by the name of Shapur I, who was a Persian king, who basically granted religious autonomy to the Jews and said, you know what, you're a distinct people among us, or whatever, whoever was living there, and you follow your own rules and regulations. And Shmuel, who was the leader of the Jews at that time, he told the Jews that we have to now begin to reconcile with the new government. Okay? So there's going to be times that we are going to have to set aside whatever we believe in, and we're going to have to follow the rules of the new government. Okay? And that became part of the Jewish tradition and became part of Jewish law. Now it's mentioned 4 times in the Talmud, the same rule, that Dina de Malchusa Dina, that the law of the land is law, that whatever is going to happen, whatever is going to come into being, you have to follow the rules of the foreign governments. Okay. Came along scholars, and they said, what's the legal basis for this? How do you know this? You know what? In the Torah it doesn't say that. If you look throughout the entire Tanakh, throughout the entire Torah, it never mentions one time that we need to follow the rules of the new government or a new king. What is the legal basis They said, it sounds good, and it's probably a good idea to do that if you want to feel, at home in a foreign country, but I want to know how you came up with this rule. Everything in Judaism, you have to come up with something. There has to be some basis for it. You can't just stand up and say, hey, follow this law. So, they quoted from a verse in one of the last books in the Torah called Nehemiah. Nehemiah lived at the end of the first temple. He saw the destruction. He also saw the rebuilding of the second temple. And in chapter 9, verse number 36 and 37, he's talking about a plea of mercy because the temple had been destroyed, the Jews had been exiled. And he says like this, he says, behold, today we are slaves, and the land that you gave to our forefathers to eat of its fruits and its bounty, behold, we are slaves upon it. It means we're not even bosses of our own country. We now have a foreign power that is ruling over us. Its produce is abundant for the benefit of kings whom you have placed over us because of our sins. They rule over our bodies and over our animals as they please, and we are in great distress. So from these words, that they rule over our bodies and over our animals, they deducted from that when they are in charge, they're in charge. That's the way it goes. That was the biblical basis for having Dina de Malchus Dina, that the law of the land is law, from this verse. Okay, fine. So that was number one. That they showed right away that there is some source, how obscure it could be, and even though it doesn't fit in exactly and says you have to listen to the ruling king, but at least we can deduce from that verse that they have a right over our body and over our animals. Fine. Other rabbis interpret the basis as a very practical thing. It's a practical a reality. Listen, we're living among Gentiles now. We're living among pagans. Now, they are the majority. We're a minority. There's going to be times that we're going to come into conflict. You got to be practical. You can't just stand out and say, you know what, we're going to follow the Torah, and that's going to be it, because we're going to get into big trouble. No. Very practical. And Jews have found that to be very, very beneficial in that kind of thinking to wherever they may be. If you notice throughout Jewish history, Jews have become the ultimate chameleon. I mean, they go into a country, they go into a land, they don't become only part of that country, but they become the best part of that country. I mean, we're Americans. No, we're not only Americans and sit on the sidelines. We become Americans and we rise, like 11 senators, almost a vice presidential hopeful we had. We have Congress people, we have people in the cabinet. I mean, we right away dig into the society and we integrate and we become part of it. Okay, so practically, you have to start figuring that we're going to have to follow the rules and regulations. Okay. Another idea for the basis was that even non-Jews, even Gentiles, are commanded by God to enact laws to preserve orderly Jewish life. They have to. I mean, there are what we call the Noahic 7 rules that everybody in the world, regardless if you're Jewish or if you're not Jewish, and especially non-Jews, are expected to follow these 7 rules. And they are basically that you have to have some kind of a court system, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't worship any idols, don't blasphemy, just be a good, what? Don't tear, don't tear animals apart, all of these things, don't commit murder, adultery, the big 3, fine. And one of them is, of course, keeping a court system. And so they have themselves a responsibility of trying to enact orderly regulatory laws to keep a society going.
Doesn't each Noahic law have subdivisions?
Oh, many subdivisions. But these are just in general. So you take 7, but then you have, tributaries, off of the 7. But just like we say 613 commandments for the Jews, and they all have, subdivisions. Same thing is true about the Noahic code. They also have subdivisions to them. So here's another reason why Jews should follow the laws of the country, because even the government themselves have to enact laws to make it, to make us, live in an orderly life. Then, of course, came along some other idea, that we have basically a contract. It's contractual. What is it? that when we move into a country, now this you have to figure out, you have to set yourself back 2,000 years. Because 2,000 years ago, most of the countries were run by monarchs. There was no such thing as democracy. What's a democracy? There's no democracy. There was emperors, there was caliphs, there were kings, there was one man, and he basically ran everything. So we basically lived with him in a contractual way. That means what happens? You know, we're here, we're your servants, you're the king, we'll do for you, and you'll do for us. So if you do for us good, we'll do for you good, and therefore we have this idea that we're going to live in peace and in harmony, and therefore we'll follow your rules and your regulations. And then lastly, the bottom line is that the king had all the power. Let's be honest. All the land belonged to the king. So whenever the king wanted to, and he wanted to, for example, take a piece of land, he was able to do that. So therefore, by these standards, we were only renting. Really only renters. And since we're only renters for the king, so therefore it made perfect sense to us, since he owns everything anyways, that we should live by the rules that he makes. Okay? It's not going to be so easy, as we're going to see. Because right now, all of these legal bases and all of these intellectual ideas sound very good. But we have to remember, we're not living in the United States of America. This is only a very, very recent experience that we have as Jewish people. We go way back, to living under the Persians, and then after we were under the Romans, and under the Christians, and then under the Muslims, and under a tremendous different type of people. And we're going to see how each one dealt with this issue. Okay, but now at least we understand basically why Shmuel could come up with this and say to us that the law of the land is law. Now to us, of course, living in America, it's not such a stretch, right? I mean, no one in here is advocating. I haven't seen any Jew advocating that we go back to biblical law and forget about American law. Just live in our own little world. No one's advocating that. We're Americans, we're proud citizens, we're good citizens. Judaism is always encouraged to be a good citizen, do the right thing for the country, and everything we want to believe that there's a quid pro quo. That if we're good citizens, the citizenry will be good to us as well. And since we've always been in the minority, it's kind of worked for us, at least till now. Now, I just threw out a general law, a general rule. The law of the land is law. But we know that there are going to be times when the rules of the country are going to come into conflict with the rules of Judaism. It's natural, because they're a different religion, there's a different a political idea, there's a different king, whatever his ideas are, and they're going to come into conflict. So I want to quote a verse to you from the Bible itself, which is found in Leviticus, in the portion of Kedoshim. It says like this: "Every man, your mother and your father shall you revere, and my Sabbath shall you observe. I am Hashem your God." Okay? So basically in that verse he's telling us two important rules. One is that you should honor your father and your mother, and the second is you should observe my Sabbath. And then he ends up by saying, I am the God your God. So commentaries have asked, why does he have to say, I am the God your God? Because there's going to come a time, there could be, theoretically, a conflict here between your father and your mother and me. Because your father will say, hey, come on, let's go fishing on Shabbos. And you're going to say, well, fishing, we've got to go to shul on Shabbos. Now you have to think, okay, so what do I do? On one hand, one of the 10 commandments is honor your father and your mother. And he wants to go fishing. But on the other hand, you have God's commandment that says, observe my Sabbaths. What do? Ani Hashem. I am God your God. Now I am the one that told you to honor your father and to fear your father and your mother. So mine takes precedent. Mine takes precedent. So we know now that whenever there's a conflict within a family between that which God said and between that which the family said, who takes precedent? God's law. So God's law always takes precedent if they come into conflict. By extension, this is the same way is true when it comes to the government. And all issues of Issur, and all issues of religious prohibitions, the rule of Dina de Malchut Dina does not apply. Doesn't apply. So for example, if the government says one must work on the Sabbath, if they enacted this law, you can't do that. You can't work on the Sabbath. Now, of course, you can ask me, what if the penalty is, between that and death? And that, we're not dealing with that. But we're just dealing with, let's say you can get out of it. You have to get out of it. If the government enacts something which is prohibited against not putting on tefillin, they prohibit the use of tefillin, or they prohibit circumcision, or they prohibit shechita, the slaughtering of animals, which has happened a number of times throughout history, we do not follow. This does not take any precedence within Judaism.
There are no conflicts.
Why would anyone have to say the law of the land is law?
I'll tell you why. Because the law, I will, in a moment, I'm going to go through here where the law is applicable. And we're going to see that there were always conflicts, and sometimes we do accept the law of the land, but not when it comes to prohibitions. So if something is prohibited, or there's a mitzvah, a positive commandment that says we must do this, and the government forbids it, which we know, take for example in the Soviet Union, for example, which was atheistic by nature, and they forbid all the study of Torah, and they forbid circumcision, and the keeping of Shabbos, and educating the children, and having a mezuzah. The law of the land is not law, because my law takes precedent over that law. So any time it came to a conflict of prohibitions, you have to say to the government, or sometimes as you have to have what we call civil disobedience, right? And civil disobedience is where you recognize that there's a government, but you respectfully say to the government, I'm sorry, but my conscience cannot allow me to follow these laws. These are immoral or anti-religious or whatever it is, and I'm not following it. And we have it even in America too, that you could be a conscientious objector, that there's certain laws of the land that it's not like you don't recognize the government. The government exists, but the government has made a law now that you, with your conscience, cannot abide by. And therefore you're respectfully, now you'll take, if you end up going to prison, you have to go to prison for your beliefs. But people have done that throughout the ages. People have done that, and people like Martin Luther King and others have shown the way.
What was the resolution of that scenario based on Leviticus?
So therefore you go to shul. You have to go to shul and not go fishing with your father, because my law takes precedent over your father's law. So if you come into conflict with the father and the Shabbos, Shabbos takes precedent. Shabbos takes precedent. And that's why we know by extension, it takes precedent not only over your father's law, but over the government's law as well, over a king's law, over any law that will come in direct contradiction to Hashem's law. Hashem's law is number one.
Even though it's a way of honoring your father.
Even though it's a way of honoring your father, but you can only honor him if up to the point. Okay. There are a number of different opinions among the rabbis is when this law actually takes effect and what type of a government. You see, because if you have an anti-religious government, it's not so hard for us to talk about not abiding by the Soviet Union laws. Yeah. Because this was an anti-religious attack, and this was a government that tried to uproot religion. So you don't have to be the big scholar to know, if the Soviet Union says no circumcision, what are you going to do? Yes, circumcision. So Soviet government says no Shabbos, you're going to have Shabbos. That's not. But there were those that argued that since the original intent was only when it came to a monarchy, that it should remain that way. So in a democratic government or a republic, we wouldn't follow the rules. But that fell apart. You know when? When they started having democracies. You see, as long as there was monarchs and monarchies, okay, it made sense. We're not only follow the king's law. But if you ended up in a republic, or you ended up under Napoleon, or you ended up under, in the United States of America, no problem. We're accepting democracies as well. So over time, historically, we will see how each individual time period brought new ideas and more expansion to Dina de Malchus Dina. But I just wanted to mention that because it originally came from a monarchy standpoint, but it didn't stay that way. Another rule has to be that the principle of equality is very important. Very, very, very important in Judaism. That means if there's a law that's discriminatory against one particular people, generally, I say, you don't have to follow that law. That means if there was law that were only enacted in the United States against Jews, only against Jews, That means that Jews had to work on Shabbos. Okay, not even forget about it. Not even Jews had to work on Shabbos. Jews had to wear a pointed hat. The government enacted that Jews had to wear a pointed hat. You don't have to wear the pointed hat. There is no responsibility within Judaism that tells you that you have to follow the dictates of the government. Why? Because there's no equality principle here. That means if everybody has to wear a white hat, okay, so you wear a white hat. It's not against Judaism. You wear a white hat. But if it's particularly against one people and one people only, and it's racism or discrimination, you don't have to follow that rule. Everybody has to be equal in the eyes. So therefore, in a king, even in a monarch, when there were times when the monarchs were benevolent, like this guy Shapur, and he did everything, and everything went well, and no problem, we followed. But at the moment some guy comes up and starts to discriminate, and boy, do we know about discrimination. Now, we've been the victims of discrimination for hundreds and thousands of years. This law falls apart. Din de Malchusa does not apply anymore. So in a dictatorship or in a communist system, would it apply? No, it wouldn't apply, because we don't have to. Those rules are only applicable in an equal society. Well, the non-equal society meaning that everybody has to follow. It's a law that it's applicable to everybody. That means we're going to get to it in a moment, because we'll see really where this comes into play. So we've already established, one, there has to be equality in the law. Two, it has to be an established, government, not a quirky come in and out, no problem. Also, it doesn't apply at all to prohibitions within the Torah. Meaning, if we gave a number of examples to that. So where does it apply to? So when do we have Dina de Malchusa Dina? So primarily when it comes to monetary rules. That's the number one real issue. Because really the government, let's say take the United States of America. Does the government really care here whether we put on tefillin or don't put on tefillin? No, we don't care. Does the government really care here if we eat kosher or don't eat kosher? No, it doesn't care. Where is really going to be the conflict that we're going to find here in the United States and in Judaism is in cases of monetary conflict. And what do I mean by that? For example, I'll give you. In Judaism, there is a law that everything needs to be established by two witnesses. That means if I have a case with one of you out there, and I want to go to a Beth Din, I want to go to a court of law, and I want to prove my case, and I have to bring two witnesses. One witness is not enough. According to Torah tells us you need to have two witnesses. That's not the rule in America. In America, if you bring one witness, you bring a signed contract, you bring this, you bring that. So here you have a case of where sometimes in court, if I sue you, and we'll get to the use of secular courts just in a minute. If I sue you and I bring one witness, what should be the rule? If we learn Dina de Malchusa Dina, according to the law of the land is law, I should pay you, right? Because the judge says, you know what, Perelmuter is wrong, you're right, I take out my money and I pay you. Here's a conflict. Because you as a Jew know that you can only extract money from me through two witnesses, or whatever the case may be. Or the laws of inheritance. The laws of inheritance in Judaism dictates to us that the oldest child, the oldest son, gets a two portion. So if you have 4 children, you split it up how many ways? 5. You split it up 5 ways. The oldest son gets 2. Everybody else gets 1/5. Is that the rule in America? No. You go to a probate court and they're not giving the first one, two portions. They're doing it whatever they want. Everybody splits equally. Okay, so everyone splits equally. The firstborn is going to say, hey, wait, hold on a second. Wait a second. I get 2 pieces. I get 2 portions. Okay. So here we see sometimes where in the United States of America itself, there's going to be conflict within the system. So that's the number one place that we're going to have to really, really dig down deep to understand how that plays within the within the American legal system vis-a-vis Judaism. Taxes. Oh, every time a king needed to raise an army, what did he do? Taxed you. Every time the United States of America needs to raise an army, what do? Tax you. Everybody can get away from taxes. I don't care if it's Adam in the Garden of Eden who's going to pay taxes, and we here in the United States of America are going to pay taxes. Now, What happens if the king just wakes up one day and says, you know what, I need more money, I'm putting $100 tax on everybody's head. Do we have to pay it? Yes. You got to pay it. Because why? Because it meets the criteria. There's equality. Everybody has to pay this tax. It doesn't go against Judaism because, you know, we're living in a contractual society with the king. He owns it anyways. So if the king says, I want $100 from everybody, and you got to pay up that $100. There are even cases that I saw that the rabbis ruled that even if the king said, I want only the Jews to pay $100, you still had to pay it. There were even times, but you know what, that had to do, of course, in the historical context. Like, you know, wherever you may find yourself, if you're like living in Spain during a certain period and the king says, I want the Jews to pay, and this is, you know, after the conquest of Christians, you know what, it's better for us, just pay the money. Just pay it. What are you going to cause a revolution? There's much more of them. We're visitors here. We're having a good time. Pay the lousy money and forget it. Let's move on. Let's hope this guy, you know, passes away. All right? Let's just do that. So the rabbis in that context would say, Dina de Malchus Dina. You have to pay. Even though a guy in shul may stand up and say, this is wrong, this is discriminatory. Yeah, we understand that. We know all of this. But we have a choice. We can not pay the tax and make them really, really angry, or pay the tax and let them be angry. So no, let us be angrier and let them get the $100. Okay, fine. Now, that itself brings us to many, many different questions. Okay? For example, if the king said, pay the tax, and a guy didn't want to pay the tax, and then the king said, okay, take away his house, and he said, okay, he appointed you to be a tax collector in the community, and said, okay, you know what, Mark, I want you to collect the taxes for me. Now, you have to go ahead and collect the taxes, and then you have to throw me out of my house. How does that play within Judaism? You are actually evicting me from my house, and can you take my house? Can he? According to the rules of Dina de Malchus Dina, yes. According to the rules of the law of the land, he may evict me from my house, throw me out, take my house, and goodbye. What if the king decides he wants to take my house? Just take it. Yeah. And then someone else goes and buys it? Now, Dina de Malchus Dina will dictate that you just got yourself a nice deal on my house. Have a good day. Or if the king decides to take my money and to build a bridge, can we cross over the bridge? Yes, we may cross over the bridge because Dina de Malchus Dina, the law of the land is law, and the king has a right to expropriate money from whoever he wants to, from the community, and he puts a tax on everybody, and that's the way it goes. And you know what comes out of that? Eminent domain. What do we do now? Here we have a case of eminent domain, where the king walked along and said, you know what, I need a new highway to go right through Belmont Shore. And everybody that lives in this path, all the homes in this path I want destroyed. And that happened very often. Very often the king wanted. Now we as Jews, how are we going to deal with that? Are we going to say, you know what, the king is expropriating it illegally, and therefore anybody that buys of that, or anybody that crosses the bridge, or anybody has any pleasure or any benefit from that, we excommunicate? Because that was the punishment back in the days, excommunicated? No. The king may go ahead, and today what happens with our government? They take it. Right? That's how you have the rules of eminent domain, that the government has a right to pass. Now we may say, hey, you know, within Judaism it's wrong, and I live here and I raise my family here, but that's too bad. Dina de Malchus Dina. And if someone goes ahead and benefits from that, that's quite okay within Judaism. There's no problem. There's no problem. Then came the issue of contracts. What if you have contracts in a legal system? Someone goes ahead and writes a contract in a foreign court, you know, in a different court. What do? It's good. Till the 13th century, this was interesting. Till the 13th century, they refused to accept contracts from a non-Jewish court. So even if you came to me and said, "Look, I have a contract, and it was written in a Spanish court, or it was written in a Babylonian court," I didn't have to accept it. After the 13th century, I think with the rise of Christianity and all of some other issues, the rabbis throughout Europe said that we are accepting contracts and all agreements that were written by non-Jewish courts. So if you have that, it's all in play. No problem. So to summarize just this part of it, just to go over this, generally the rules of Dina de Malchus Dina apply to a government that is non-discriminatory, that plays fair and has laws that are applicable to everybody, who have a right to expropriate and to place taxes upon everybody, whose court system is fair and equitable, and as such, whenever there's a case that happens in this kind of a milieu, in this kind of a government, dina de malchus dina. The law of the land is law. Now, let us pose a few questions. For example, may you go to a secular court here in America, okay? You have a problem with me, I'm your neighbor, I said put up a fence, I don't put up the fence, you know the fence was broken down, you want to force me to put up the fence, okay? We have what we call in Hebrew a sichsoch. We have a little problem between us, a monetary contention between the two families, okay? And I'm sure this has happened 1 billion times over history. Where do we go? What do we do? How do we settle this? Okay. The moment you take this case to a secular authority is the moment that the community is going to put you in excommunication. Even though that everything I said till now, and all I said about the American government, what a wonderful government this is in a democratic country, and we Jews have risen to the top, and we love this country. The moment you go to a secular court is the moment that the community will put you in, excommunicate you. This is one of the worst things that you can possibly do as a Jewish person, is to go outside of the legal system to a secular court. What do you have to do? What's your recourse? Your recourse is to go to what we call a Beth Din. And a Beth Din is very simply made up of 3 rabbis who are going to adjudicate this case according to the laws of Judaism, and not American secular laws, but according to the laws of the Talmud. Now you may say, okay, Rabbi, you know what? It's good if you're talking about people that care about a Beth Din, right? They care about a court of Jewish law. But what about most Jews who don't care about a Beth Din? I have neighbors on my street, I'll tell them, come to a Beth Din. They'll go, brrr, what are you, nuts or something? Who's going to a Beth Din? You know what, we want to go to court. You still cannot go to court. If I have an accident with another Jew, I cannot take them to secular court. I have to first go to the Beth Din. Now, what the Beth Din can do, and probably will do, is send them an invitation to come. They say, you must appear before us at this and this day. They send 3 invitations by registered mail. If the person still refuses, then what I get is what we call a ptur. I get an exemption. And that exemption says, now you may step out and go to a secular court. You may go to a secular court. But that's only after I've used all of my ways of trying to adjudicate and this case in a Jewish milieu. Why? Because it's very, very simple to understand. The moment the rabbis allow us to step out of this and go to secular court and allow the secular courts to adjudicate Jewish cases is the moment that Judaism is over. It's over. It's finished. Because then absolutely every case will go to a secular court, and every time the secular court puts a ruling and it's against Judaism, and I say, ha ha ha, look at that, the court ruled, so forget about it. What do we need Jewish laws for? So that's why they tried their best against all odds to keep the Jewish community structured that we would only follow the Jewish Beth Din, the Jewish court. Now, sometimes it's practical and sometimes it's not practical. If you're living in Israel, very practical. Okay, no problem. If you're living in Los Angeles, it's not practical. What do? You're going to hit a guy that's a secular Jew. You think he cares about the Beth Din? What does he care about going to 3 Orthodox rabbis who are going to listen to the case? He'll fight you on, as they say. He's going to say, I'm not interested. At that point, you still have to go through the procedure. You still must initially go to a Beth Din. And there's a Beth Din here, there's a Beth Din there, there's a Beth Din here. You find out where the Jewish courts are. Only afterwards may you go to a secular court. Now, what happens if the secular court, now, you go to a secular court and they decide something that's against the Torah? That means, you know what, he was clearly, according to the rules of the Torah, I was innocent. But because of common law, doesn't always see eye to eye with the Torah, there could be some conflict, and it rules against me. What happens then? Then we have a problem. Because legally, you can get the money from the other party, but can you take the money if it's against the Torah? No. Then, in that case, it doesn't go dina de malchus dina. It doesn't go the law of the land is law because it's against the words of the Torah. So we have to be very careful. We have to be very, very judicious when we come into cases that we have to go outside, because even though that we're good citizens, and this has nothing to do with trying to not be good Americans or trying to somehow be better than the legal system. Has nothing to do with that. Absolutely nothing, because we still have to follow all of the rules. You got to pay your taxes. You got to drive 65 now. You got to do all of those things that the American government tells you to do. But when it comes to appropriating and expropriating money from somebody else, you have to go through the Jewish legal system. This is a fundamental rule. Go ahead, Shoshana.
I understand it's only if there's two Jews involved.
Yeah.
If it's a Jew and a non-Jew.
Well, as a Jew and a non-Jew, you don't have to. A Jew and a non-Jew, of course, because a Jew and a non-Jew, of course, you're going to go to secular court right away. I mean, that's because there's no need to go to a Jewish court with a non-Jew. You could go to secular court immediately. But that's only when between two Jews you can't do that. And hopefully, I made that. I made that clear. I'm going to bring up some cases now. And we'll try to analyze these cases according to the principles that we've laid down for Dina de Malchus Din, and see if we could come up with some ruling. They're not always so easy. And then I don't want to claim that in this class or right now we're going to be able to sufficiently answer all of the questions that are going to come up. But here's a few examples that came up that when I was doing my research, just popped up to me, and they became interesting cases. In the Middle Ages, the government used to appoint people to religious bodies. How did it work? Here in America, it's so unique because we have what is called the separation of church and state. Meaning that the government, however you're going to understand this, is the government should not get involved in religion here in this country. That means that the furthest thing that we need right now is the government should say, okay, you know what, you need to daven Nusach Svard. We don't like the fact that you daven this particular way. We want you to buy only your sitters from the Berman house, and that's the way it goes. Kahot, no good. We know they're no good anyways. They don't have the Tanya, they don't have the Tanya there. But you know what? But only from Berman house. The government doesn't care. So here, for example, is not a good example. But in Europe, for centuries, how the governments would do is they would appoint people to be the heads of religious communities. And not only that, but for example, in Germany, which was extremely well structured, what did they used to do? They used to have everything was governed through this body. Through this body, all of the money was shuffled to the community. Everything was shuffled to the community. Okay? So it was a great prestige. I mean, if you were someone that they said, okay, you know, we'd like you to be appointed, we want you to be appointed to a position of leadership. Now I'm great. So normally, if this was a just government, if this was something that was an appealing government, and they put you in a position of leadership, not a problem, right? It was good. What happens if you're put into a position where you have to be a lackey to the government? Okay? Where the government wants you to act only as their agent. What do? Do you accept this position or you don't accept this position? What do you say? The government says, I want you to act as the gabbai this year in Shul. And you say, no, I don't want to be a gabbai, because you know that the government is going to force you to do things that that are going to go against your principles. What do? Now you think that this is a theoretical question, but this happened all the time. This happened all the time in governments, because this is one way of keeping control. You don't put in charge someone that's going to be anti-government, anti-establishment. You put in establishment people. And all the time this happened where people rose to levels of prominence within the Jewish community, and the community had tremendous problem, because you know what they were? They were just agents. Agents for government. So here you're in the position of, what do? What am I going to do? Should I go? Should I not go? On one hand, it's very hard to tell the Kaiser that, you know what, I don't want to exactly be the gabbai, because you know what, if you say no to the government, you're in big trouble. On the other hand, you have a responsibility to the Jewish community. So where does your principles lay, and what are you going to make your priority? So if you're a man of great fortitude, somehow you find your way out of this. So, but if it's a good government and a good body, no problem. But if it's going to impact your Judaism, somehow you're going to have to say, you know what, no. It's not going to be so easy, but you're going to have to do that. Thank God here we don't have these issues. We don't have a problem. But in the olden days, or even today, Even today, what if you happen to be a tremendous environmentalist? A tremendous environmentalist, and you get appointed to some, some advisory board, okay? Some advisory board where your principles are going to be challenged. What do you do? What do you do? You know that this agency is going to be wanting to drill, let's say, and you don't want to drill, so you have to make some kind of a cheshbon nefesh. You have to go through some kind of an accounting within your own soul to come up with the right answer. Not always is it so simply dina de malchus dina. Well, the law of the land is law, and that's what they say. Hey, and I'm going to do this, and that's the way it's going to be, and have a good day. No. Sometimes you need to look into your conscience, even when the government says to do something like that. You need to be able to stand up and be counted. Now, it's easy for me to say because generally doesn't happen to me. I don't get appointed to any of these either environmental or anti-environmental positions. But sometimes you have to really weigh, even here in the United States of America. Prohibition. Now everybody was born post-prohibition. But there was a time once in this country where they prohibited the sale and consumption of alcohol, right? And that included any type of alcohol, including wine, right? Okay, including wine. Now we have a problem. What is our problem? The problem is Kiddush. Kiddush. What do you do for Kiddush?
The Catholic Church has sacramental.
Okay, so what they did was they made a concession. They made a concession. But let's say they wouldn't have made that concession for sacramental wine. They wouldn't have said you can have Kiddush on a Friday night. They would have put across the board. They would have said wine is prohibited. Wine is prohibited. What would we have done? Would you go out and contact Sam Bronfman and say, hey, Sam, I know you live up in Canada. We need 6 cases of Manischewitz Concord delivered here. Or would you say, well, look, the law of the land is law, and that's the way it is. So here's a case where we would have to sit down as a governing board of the shul and think to ourselves, what are we going to do? Can we go out without Kiddush? This is 3,000 years in the making. Kiddush is one of the most fundamental things on Shabbos. You start off the Shabbos with Kiddush. Now you may say, hey, what about beer? Beer is also outlawed. What about Jack Daniels? Also outlawed. Everything you try is outlawed. So probably in that case, if it came down, I'm not giving you a definitive halachic ruling over here, but if these two collided, where you needed the wine and there was a prohibition, what will we go for? We'd go to wine. We'd go for the wine. We'd have to say these are one of the cases where you have to be, what do you call those guys? A conscientious objector. You have to drink the wine.
What's the matter with grape juice?
Oh, okay. So grape juice is a good example, but grape juice is good, but not as good as wine. Now, of course, if there's nothing else except grape juice, fine. But if there was no grape juice around, what if they weren't producing grape juice and I'm talking theoretically, of course. Theoretically, we'd have to go for the wine. Here's a case where you would have to go against what your government, because we feel that this is an unjust, and I'm not talking about for the pleasurement of drinking wine. I'm not saying, have a glass of wine with your, with your fish. I'm not talking about that. But for religious purposes, we'd have to go with the wine. And look what happened. Eventually, prohibition, anyways.
The penalty was so severe that it profoundly impacted the shul.
That's a good question. That is a good question. That's a good question, because in reality, what was the penalty for having wine in a shul? They wouldn't throw you in jail and throw the key away. If the penalty was such that it ratcheted up to a place where we could, then of course you don't have to. Then you have to go on Mesiras Nefesh. This is not one of the rules where you have to go for self-sacrifice. See, if they said, hey, you know what, I want everyone to worship an idol, you got to go self-sacrifice. If they say you got to murder somebody, you got to go on self-sacrifice. Wine is not one of these self-sacrificial laws that you have to extend yourself for martyrdom. You don't have to go to martyrdom. But if it's a case of sitting in jail for a day, I would do it.
What if it was a financial penalty?
That was going to bankrupt the shul.
Oh, no, if it was going to bankrupt the shul, then I would vote against it. I would vote against it. Why take the chance? And bankrupt the shul, we'll make Kiddush on Challah instead. But if it wasn't in that case, I'm just talking about if it was an even bet. If it was an even bet, you know what, you'll get a penalty, we'll fine you $50 or whatever it is, you know what, we don't want you to do it again, I would go with the wine. Certainly if they ratchet it up to the point of you're in the Soviet Union, you're talking about in Russia, and you know, they put you in a gulag for 20 years. So there were people that made decisions to do it. Like, for example, a bris. A bris is not a martyrdom issue. If someone puts a gun to your head and said, if you circumcise yourself, I'm going to blow your head off, you don't have to circumcise your son. In Russia, they did do it. People went on Mesiras Nefesh, on martyrdom. You know why? Because they said we have to make a statement. We have to make a statement to the government. Not only that, in the Talmud they tell a story of Arnika, what do they call it? Arnika, the yellow shoelace. In the Tractate of Sanhedrin, it talks about a case of where the government says, you know what? Jews have to wear yellow shoelaces. Or, if you don't wear yellow shoelaces, we'll put you to death. There were people that argued, don't wear the yellow shoelaces. Don't wear them. Even though that this is not a martyrdom issue. It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah, you know, if you wear yellow shoelaces, you have to let yourself. It's an issue of a statement. It's a statement. I'm not going to do this. Why? Because I know that they're trying to belittle us and to discriminate against us and do all that. Just like Rosa Parks. Just think about Rosa Parks. Whatever the aura around her. Right? She sat down in front of the bus. Would anybody argue in that case, Dina de Malchus Dina? Would anybody say the law of the land is law, that she should have no right to sit in any seat that she wanted to? I don't think anybody would argue that way. And eventually America realized its error of its mistakes and went along with her. So there are some times, even when there are laws that are enacted, if we feel that they're discriminatory or they're unuseful to the country or whatever it is, we have a right to disagree. We have a right to disagree, and I'll accept the penalty. If I'll accept the penalty to that. Another one that came up that I thought that was very interesting is intellectual property. Okay? Now we know you're not allowed to steal. We know I can't come to your house, you know what, and take something out of your house and walk away with it. Everybody agrees to that. What happens now when a company like Napster comes around? Now, if you have teenagers or you have kids, I know people in our age, no, at least my age, not your age, but people, you know, my age, I don't know from Napster, I don't know from Snapster. I know, but my kids know. My kids know Napster, and this is one of the biggest things that go around, right? One of the biggest things is downloading free files. You're on the internet. Everybody now is on the internet. You download files, you use them, you print them, you do all of these things. What about intellectual property? Now, you would not go to, for example, to Mick Jagger's house and walk into his house, crack open the door, and walk out with a sofa. You wouldn't do that. But would anybody refrain from going online to Napster, who has downloaded every Rolling Stones song, and just downloading it onto your MP3 player or your iPod? Millions of kids did it. Millions of kids did it. And it became a question in halacha. It became a question within the Jewish rabbinate if this is illegal or if it's not illegal. On one hand, you say to yourself, okay, you know what? It's someone owns this, right? Someone owns this music, it's trademarked, it was paid for, they worked hard for it. Okay, fine, that's one thing. Other people argued that geneva, that thievery, only applies to something that you actually take from the other person. You actually take, you know, Bob has a cup of Java, I go ahead and I take the Java, you're missing it. There's something in you that you are missing. Here, what are they missing? They're not missing anything. It's out there in the world. Napster has already downloaded it. It's not like I'm going into Mick Jagger's pocket and pulling out the tapes of a song. Napster has already taken it into this sphere, and what I'm doing is I'm taking it now from Napster. Is it thievery? Is it not thievery? What about publishing someone's notes? Publishing someone's notes. You know, I find Bob's notes in his house. You know, brilliant paper. Bob doesn't know that Bob doesn't know that I have it, and I go behind his back and I publish it. You know, so here became a tremendous debate about this. To what exactly? Now, Dina de Malchus Dina plays a part in it. The laws of the land is law, because on one hand you would say, well, it belongs to me. But what exactly is intellectual property? What does it mean that you have an idea? Okay, so we built this whole thing based upon that we have what is called a what do you call that? A patent. Thank you. When you have a patent. So you go there and you put a patent on this, and the patent says, I have trademarked the word three-peat. You know the word three-peat is patented by Pat Riley. Okay? He has a patent on the term three-peat. Now, that's unbelievable because what does the word three-peat mean? He took three and he put peat, put them together, and it's a three-peat. So every time someone uses the word three-peat, does Pat Riley get a nickel? No. He doesn't get a nickel, and we can use the word three-peat without having to actually pay Pat Riley any money. But if you want to like print it on a shirt, or you have to something which is mamoshes, we call it, something that has physical qualities and boundaries, yeah, you're going to have to pay. So here we see already an example of where we can bifurcate. So use the word three-peat, 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 three-peat. I'm using the word, I'm not paying Pat Riley a penny, because what can he do to me? He can't sue me because that's an intellectual property. Put it on a t-shirt, I have to pay. So here became I saw myself in the research that there were many rabbis that were pro-Napster that said, you know what, intellectual property you cannot have a patent on, because in Judaism, even though the law of the land is you can't, that Napster had to shut down. The government shut down Napster. You know what? But still, after everything is said and done, you can't do that. You can't do that. And other rabbis said, you can. Back and forth and back and forth. My opinion is, you got to walk very, very carefully on this. Very carefully. Because even though intellectual property may be out there and may be useful, I don't think we want to teach our children this kind of thing, because I think there's something about the morality and ethics of all of this, which is a very gray area here. But I just wanted to show you this issue, because here came this whole idea where we never had before, the internet, right? The internet. Now you go to Kinko's with a book, and you say, I would like you to print page 25 5 times. They won't do it for you. They will not do it for you. Because why? There's a copyright to the book. Yet, go into Kinko's, don't go to the people. You go to the copy machine, self-service, you take the book and make 200 copies, they'll take your money. They don't care. We can't do it. We can on this machine, Kodesh Lashem. This machine is dedicated to God. That machine, do whatever you want. Even though they know, I'm standing there with the copies, which they themselves would not print. But, so here you have these gray areas of Dina de Malchus Dina. Now in reality, can I make 10 copies of this Chumash without paying Stone the necessary kickbacks for using it? Yeah, I don't ask. All right, I don't ask, and I don't want to know whether it is, because here already they were paid already for this chumash. I paid it, I bought it. I want to get some benefit from it. I think this belongs to me. But in reality, Kinko's will not let you print on their machines 25 copies of a book because there's a patent on the book. So here you have all of these issues now that are coming up more and more, because now more and more things are on the internet. You want to download not a song, but you want to download a report that someone wrote. Can you? Do you have to pay the guy? Does it belong to him? What does it belong? What is it? It's an idea. It's somewhere out there in cyberspace. So all of these things are being debated right now, back and forth and back and forth. It's a fascinating thing that's going on now in halacha, in the world of Dina de Malchus Dina. The laws of the land are laws, but sometimes there's very gray areas. This one I found.
Isn't that just where, if you profit from somebody else's idea, is there a clear distinction at that point in time? Then you have to go and pay the royalty. But that's not was the argument against Napster. The argument against Napster is that you haven't paid. I'm not benefit. That was the argument of the plaintiff. Here, look, what am I doing? I'm just downloading a song. I'm not doing anything. No, you're stealing from us because you should be buying the CD, but I don't like the whole CD. Your whole CD is no good. There's one song I happen to like on your CD. I should spend $17 on it. That was the whole idea, that it was already paid for. You already got your money from it. It was out in the stores already. So this is where the gray area comes in, to know exactly. I thought there were two areas. One in which you go and take it, like download it, just for your own personal use.
Right.
You can go and take that and then go and make money from it.
Now there's always been, since I've been a little kid. Any sporting event will tell you,
any reproduction or any part of this is strictly prohibited without permission of the commissioner of baseball and NBC. Didn't you hear that every single game you watch, without the NHL written permission? And I always thought to myself, what the heck? Are you telling me that if I tape this and I have 5 friends over, I can't show this? No, I can't, like Paul said, I can't profit from this. I mean, I could tape it and show it to my friends, but if I want to profit from it, that already is a completely different thing. That he's absolutely right. That's stealing, and that's you're taking someone else's product. But even then, what are you really stealing? An image? Okay, so it goes back and forth on this.
You said there has to be profit.
No, I'm talking about not profit, because in the case of Napster,
If you download.
in the case of Napster, there was no profit.
Okay, well.
I'm saying in the case of a baseball game, for example, where there.
Let's go back to Napster.
Let's go back to Napster. Napster, there was no profit. I do it for my own personal sake. I go into Napster.
But you're stealing.
That's the question. That's what the question is about here. Am I stealing?
There is personal gain because by doing that, you are not laying out money.
That's exactly. So that was where the question. That's where the question became: is it stealing or is it not stealing? Because on one hand, stealing is only if I take something from out of your pocket, I carry it around with me. Here, it's a song already.
Indirectly.
Well, okay, so that's where the argument came in, and it's still being debated because as the internet and cyberspace expands more and more and more, we're going to get into these more and more gray areas. Every place, like for example, this other issue really fascinated me. You don't even think about it because you're really not in, and that is that in the medical world, there is this idea of dispensing marijuana for medical care. That was a hot issue. Oh, was this a hot issue debated? Why? Because let's go back to the original intent of what this is about. Okay? There's 2 things here. There's 2 things. There's 1, the use of marijuana, and 2, the responsibility of a doctor to his patient. 2 separate issues altogether. So let's take the prohibition against marijuana. Okay? Okay. So let's talk about the prohibition against marijuana for a second. And this is not going to be a definitive course here saying, I am pro-legalization or anti-legalization. Okay? Reb Moshe Feinstein wrote his responsa concerning marijuana in the early part of the 1970s, where he said marijuana is prohibited for a number of different reasons, not only because the government is against it, because cigarettes are I can't say they're kosher, but they're not prohibited. You could smoke within Judaism, even though you can make a number of different arguments why cigarettes should be prohibited. One, it's against the health, and it's against this, and it smells bad, and it doesn't do anything good for you. Well, it's not. The rabbis have not prohibited smoking tobacco. Marijuana, the government has prohibited. And Rabbi Moshe said the reason why the prohibition should stand is because of 3 or 4 different ones. One, it kind of clouds your mind, and since it clouds your mind, it doesn't let you make an honest decision. And since it doesn't let you make an honest decision, you are doing something harmful for yourself. So therefore, you can't use marijuana. So he prohibited the use of marijuana. Okay. Oh, okay. So now, you know what? We'll get to alcohol in a second. Just wait. We're dealing now with marijuana, because marijuana is a little easier because it already had the prohibition of the government. So he said marijuana is usher. He threw a blanket prohibition against using marijuana. Okay, fine. Now the reasons that he gave, because of the clouding of the mind, and it distorts, and it leads to other bad things, and it distorts perception, and all of these things. Fine, good, fine. Can make a good decision. Great. Okay, now we come to a doctor, okay? And the doctor's responsibility to a patient is to care for them, not to harm them, to do the best that they could possibly do. You take the Hippocratic oath, making sure that, you put the needs of the patient above everything else, before profit, before everything else, you have to worry about the patient. Now, I'm not a medical, I'm not a doctor, but studies have shown that certainly people with glaucoma or cancer or whatever it is, smoking marijuana certainly alleviates their pain. It helps their pain. It makes them feel better. Okay? So now we're faced with this dilemma. So what do you do? A patient comes to you and he says to you, doctor, I'm unfortunately suffering from cancer and I'm in tremendous pain. I'm in tremendous pain. I need to smoke marijuana. On the other hand, comes along the secular government and says marijuana is prohibited. You can't bring marijuana, it's prohibited smoking marijuana. And you're a doctor, and you're a Jewish doctor, okay? And you look to halacha, you look to the Torah for some guidance. What are you going to do? What are you going to do in this case? On one hand, you have these two conflicts. You have the patient that needs the marijuana. On the other hand, you have the prohibition of dina de malchus dina. The law of the land is law here. You can't just dispense marijuana. Certainly, no one's going to say you could dispense marijuana indiscriminately to anybody that walks into your office. You're going to write him a prescription for marijuana, but here's a patient that really needs it. Oh, the debate was raging. Some rabbis were of the case, no. If you allow them to do it, then you're showing that Judaism is a farce, and then you have to keep prohibition. But I would say, why would it be? Because the laws of the land says that marijuana is prohibited. Everybody's against. You have ads out there, so you can't dispense marijuana. What about the patient? What about the needs of the patient? Well, you know what? There's a lot of needs of different patients. Let's work harder. Let's work, to alleviate the pain through some legal manners. You can't step out of the boundaries. These were the constructionists, right? They didn't want you. No way they're going to allow. Because you know what? Because just the term marijuana conjures up such images of drug abuse. Forget about it.
You know what heroin was used for?
Oh.
Early on when it was legal?
What, for?
It was used for a lot of things.
For a lot of different things, yes, sure.
It was perfectly legal.
In 1900, I think, no, not 25%, was it 5% or 10% of Americans were addicted to cocaine in 1900. 5 or 10% of the population was addicted to cocaine. Because cocaine was everywhere. They were addicted to cocaine. This was just recently on some flipping history channel, probably on my way from back to New York. I must have heard the statistic. Okay? The other side of it was absolutely, a doctor should absolutely prescribe and dispense marijuana. Because you know why? Because all of the reasons that Rabbi Moshe gave, all of the reasons that distorts reality, doesn't come into play because the patient's needs are number one. So even though that marijuana is prohibited, but the fact is that if a patient needs it and it's going to make his life, the value of his life better, and it's going to help him along, dispense it. And I think that after everything is said and done, back to the debates back and forth. I mean, again, I don't want to give a halachic ruling, but if I was a doctor and this was the case, I would dispense the marijuana. I would give the marijuana. I'd have to say these are one of the cases that even though dina de malchus dina, even though the law of the land is law, what you still have to follow your conscience. And I think this is one of the cases that I would follow my conscience before following the laws of the land. Now, of course, you're going to suffer the consequences. I mean, they can arrest you, they can do this, but you know what? Sometimes you have to stand up for what's right. And I think in this case, this is right. This is absolutely right. But I thought it was fascinating. I mean, the debate that was going on between several rabbis back and forth, debating about what should be done. Here's a case. Think about this case.
That's just in Orthodox circles.
Yeah, that's just in Orthodox circles. Yeah, that's just in Orthodox circles because there's other circles that don't take halacha. See, we take halacha seriously. So we're not going to. Others say halacha is a good guide, but it doesn't have a veto power. We say halacha has veto power. So if Rabbi Moshe, for example, would have said doctors cannot dispense medicine, we'd have a tougher time. Because he was the ruler, and he made not the ruler, but he was the arbiter, and he said it would have been harder for us to argue. But since he only talked about the prohibition of marijuana, just in a very general sense, then it was easier to come up with this ruling in this particular case.
Marijuana was the only remedy. Then I guess you make a case.
That's exactly. Thank you very much. Thank you. Since you hit on the nail on the head of one of their arguments. It said because you know what? What if the only remedy would be to eat pork? What if the guys, the remedy would be to eat pork? What would we do? We'd run now and right and we'd get this guy the biggest double in the whole world and feed it to him and say, please eat the pork, eat the chazer, you know what? Eat the bacon no matter what. And they extended it by saying, if you're going to let it for pork, come on. If you're going to allow pork to be eaten and to save a guy's life, how much more marijuana? Okay, so that was exactly, you hit it right on the head by saying since we do step outside of the boundaries, already have halacha to save someone's life, let's do it here for marijuana as well. Even though you may argue, okay, it's not life-saving, You don't know. How do you know if the guy's in tremendous pain and this can help them? You do it. I mean, no one's going to argue that if you have a pill that came straight out of a chaz's heart, right? Right out of a pig's heart, that you can't take it. Everybody will take it with water, with a blessing, with everything. You'll do it. On Yom Kippur. Absolutely. Same thing is true about this. That's what their argument was. Now, alcohol is very different. Alcohol is different because alcohol is permitted. No. Now you're going to say, what about? No, if you take a little one shot of wine, doesn't distort you. Now, if you abuse it, so abusing, you shouldn't abuse it. But to say that it's prohibited to take a shot of Jack Daniels is prohibited, this would make them misnagdim, and I don't know if they would, I don't know who wants to go into that level of, God forbid, they would outlaw alcohol altogether. What would Hasidim do? For their Farbrengens. But in reality, alcohol is permitted. Now, in the case of abuse, sure, rabbis are forever banging away. Don't abuse alcohol. Don't drink more than is necessary. Because there is a mitzvah. What happens in this mitzvah on Purim? It says in the Talmud that you have to drink enough alcohol not to remember blessed is Mordechai or wicked is Haman. So you have a question. Now, what do? Do you abuse the alcohol? But there's no prohibition. There's no governmental prohibition. So the case of Dina de Malchus Dina doesn't come into play. You may want to say, hey, you know what? It's a good idea for rabbis to outlaw liquor, which possibly might be a good idea. It's a good idea for rabbis to outlaw cigarettes, which is a good idea, and all of that thing, all of that stuff. But as far as Dina de Malchus Dina, what we're talking about this evening, about the law of the land is law, that doesn't come into play because it's permitted, so it doesn't really have any effect.
I mentioned that because earlier you said that marijuana clouds the mind.
Too much, of course. Too much, but you see what? But also, when you get into that, there's a whole slippery slide over here about legislating morality. See, this is what the argument of legalizing marijuana. Why are you telling me that I can't do it? Why not? You can remember. When I was in Massachusetts, they enacted the seatbelt law. You have to wear a seatbelt. Came along one guy on the radio, and he led a campaign to repeal it, and he won. They repealed the seatbelt law, and his argument was not that I'm a conservative, but government cannot dictate to you what you do in your personal house. What's next? You know how many people fall in the shower and hurt themselves? They fall in the shower, they break their knee. Now what happens when you break your knee? You have to go to the hospital. Even worse, you can have a tremendous debilitating accident. You can become a paraplegic. Right? What happens if you become a paraplegic in your shower? Who pays? Because the argument of the seatbelt makers were, you know why we have to enact seatbelts? Because in an accident, what happens is people get so brutally hurt, so badly hurt that they end up in a hospital and hundreds of thousands. Who pays? The taxpayers. That's why we have a right to dictate to you. Okay, so what about a shower? I'm in the shower and I'm singing a song, Pavarotti, and I slip and I break my back. Okay, so from now on, what the government is going to dictate, you have to have bath mats. That's it. Everybody has to have a mat in their bath. So unless you shouldn't fall. Or you know what? Or accidents happen in your house when you climb a ladder, so no one should climb a ladder. I mean, you can't. So this was his argument. Once it was repealed, then you can wear a seatbelt. But that's what legislating morality is very, very difficult. Very difficult.
They repeal building codes?
No, they didn't repeal building codes.
Why not?
Well, no, it's a good argument. It's a good argument that we should not have. But you know what? There comes a point in time where we're going to have to. Believe me, I'm not here to defend Jerry Williams in his campaign. I mean, I happen to agree with him because I didn't like the fact that the money came from big car manufacturers. To put the seatbelt laws, and I always felt I do want. But building codes is very different. Why? Because that comes into you're cheating me. Okay? Because I walk into this house and you're selling me a perfectly brand new house. Could be it's not a perfectly brand new house. It could be it's not. So therefore I think that the building codes were enacted to protect the buyer. That I don't think so much is a case of legislating morality as, you can't sell milk. The reason why they put milk is because people are going to cheat you on sour milk. That becomes already outside of morality. That's just cheating.
Why is the seatbelt law any different?
But why should a seatbelt law cheat? And who are they cheating? Who are you cheating? See, if there was no building codes and I wasn't protecting you from an unscrupulous builder, that's one thing.
Financial.
Yeah, I'm talking about financial.
Well, what about the building codes that said that you can't use, leaded paint?
Yeah, well,
Why?
why not? It's a health hazard. It's a health hazard. It's a
Or
health
I
risk.
can build my own house without subscribing to the codes and having it inspected.
No, it's true. I'm not disagreeing. It could be extended all the way till we have no laws.
An argumentum out of
Right. And yeah, absolutely. That's why you have two. That's why you have always two sides of the argument. And one side of the argument will say, I can understand this, but I don't want this. I don't want them, dealing with me. Cell phones, for example. Now we're going to have, in a couple of years, we're not going to be able to talk on our cell phones. That's going to be, again, legislating a thing where, for safety purposes, right? For safety purposes. Now, real libertarians will argue, why? A Michiganer wants to drive on a cell phone. He'll get himself killed. It's fine.
The problem there is he'll kill someone else.
Okay, so therefore you have both sides of an argument. That's why we have referendums in America, and we thank God that we have this type of a government where I could sit here and have one position, you could have another position, and let the majority rule. Let the majority rule, and that's what a democracy is, rather than have a monarchy which will say, okay, you know what? No one can talk on cell phones, and then and if you do talk on cell phones, you only have to buy from my company. I mean, that's the greatness of America back in the greatness of America.
When Reb Moshe Feinstein made his ruling,
Right.
pronouncement,
Yeah.
were there witnesses? Did they have people coming before them, or was this just something that was debated amongst the hierarchy and?
You mean when he had a certain system of how he went about before he gave a response.
How does a bet then work? I mean, in a situation like this, would they have patients come in and talk?
Of course. You'd have you do your research. You do your research. You find out. You call experts. You call people who are scientists. Moshe was a serious guy. That's why we trusted him. We trusted that he did his research before he put out a pronouncement. So I'm sure that I don't know if he ever smoked marijuana. To see if it was what effect it had on a person. But I'm sure he was a serious guy and did his research and then looked back in halacha for precedent and came out with a ruling. That's why he was accepted. A guy just walks down the street and says, nah, it's no good, then no one's going to take him seriously. But he was a serious, guy.
I'm not sure. I think what Bob was asking was, did it come out of a particular case in front of him, or was it just observed as a societal concern?
Probably somebody asked him. I'm sure someone probably asked him. They said, Rabbi Moshe, there's a big issue of marijuana going on now. What's your opinion? Because there are people that say yes, and there are people that say no, and there are people that say legalize it, and people say don't legalize it. And it was an issue that he felt that it's important enough to put a pronouncement out there. And he went about and did it. Now again, Rabbi Moshe is one voice, even though that he was the one voice that the Orthodox community followed him. But he could be argued against. And I'm sure that if someone went to him and said to him, Rabbi Moshe, I saw in one of your tshuvas, in one of your responses, that you argued this and that and that and that, and I think that it's wrong or scientifically you're wrong, I'm sure Rabbi Moshe would take that in consideration and retract. I mean, I'm sure he did in his life, because he's certainly not Moses. He's certainly not Moses. But here's another case to ponder. Okay, we talk about building codes. So we brought this up. Okay. The shul here, before Rosh Hashanah, okay? It's before Rosh Hashanah, and we have a seating committee, and the seating committee, not in our shul, but in normal shuls, they have a seating committee that you actually sell seats. So let's just pretend that we're in an actually real shul, let's say, okay? And we sit down a couple of weeks before Rosh Hashanah, and we say, wow, ticket sales are brisk. You know what? I mean, this looks like a pretty good year. 10 days before Rosh Hashanah, we're sold out. And we're still getting phone calls. Oh, so what are we going to do? So we've seated all of our members, but we decide as a committee that we are going to put 50 extra chairs in the back. Okay? Because we want to be able to accommodate people who want to daven Rosh Hashanah. We feel this is moral and ethical to do something like that, even without the money. Then we take a look. You see that sign back there? See that sign? In the corner? Seating capacity. Seating capacity says that we are only allowed to have 48 people in this room. But we put seats up for 60 people in this room, or whatever. Okay? We decided, One guy on the seating committee is upset because he reads this sign and takes this very seriously and goes to the city and says, I want you to know that our shul made a conscious decision to put out 50 extra chairs on Rosh Hashanah, and I just want to let you know that they're breaking the building. It's a building code regulation. Okay? Now, here's the case. Okay? So what do? Do you take back the 50 chairs? Do you take off the 50 chairs? And how do you deal with this guy? What do? Do you say, Dina de Malchus Dina? Well, you know what? The laws of the land is law. And they said 48 people here, even though there's plenty of room. We're not talking about a hazard. I'm not talking about blocking a fire hazard or putting people's lives in danger. No. We have enough room. Look, the city is very, 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 very conservative when it puts that figure on the board. 48 chairs in here, it's like nothing, 48 chairs. We could easily fit 50, 60 chairs in here. We've had upward of 80 people in this room without causing a fire hazard. What do?
We're in trouble on high holy days.
Yeah. Oh, in high holy days? Oh, yeah.
Look at those numbers.
Oh, forget. I don't even look at the numbers.
96.
That's why I drink liquor. But the 96 is only for one section of the room.
I know.
Yeah, but it's not for the whole room.
Each side.
Each section probably is allowed 96. So, what do? That this was a case that came up. This was an actual test case that came up and dealing with Dina de Malchus Dina. So there's two issues over here. One is, what do you do with the chairs? Because now you're worried, what if the fire marshal walks in and finds us out and now discovers it? Okay, and secondly, what do you do with this guy? Do you call this guy a hero or is he a paskodniak? What is this guy? On one hand, if you're going according to the rules and regulations, you say this guy is a hero, right? He went ahead and he told the city and he was going to make sure that all the rules are followed. Not so simple. No, it's not so simple. What do? So you have to sit down and debate and go back and forth. Now, I'm afraid to say, because we're on camera, this is for prosperity, but to me, I take that guy and I pay his ticket to another show so fast. I send them to another show. I say, you know what? You're absolutely correct, and you're a hero, but I'd like you to go to the show in Utah. Okay, and we're paying for your ticket. We actually packed up your house. It's already ready to go.
There's a shul in Ogden, right?
There's a shul in Ogden, and you belong in that shul. Because to me, it's crazy. Now, you might say, if you're a strict guy, according to Dina de Malchus Dina, and after talking for an hour, and you say the laws of the land is the law, and this is an elected government here in Long Beach, but these are one of the things in the gray area zone of rules where it doesn't hurt anybody. It's not hurting anybody. It's actually helping 50 people come to shul and Rosh Hashanah, and Paul has something to say.
Unfortunately, though, if something goes wrong at the event in which you
Right.
are overseated,
Yes.
the shul is going to be in deep doo-doo.
The shul's going to be in deep doo-doo, but sometimes you got to take a chance in life.
All right.
You got to take a chance in life to say to yourself, listen, if that's the same way of saying, you know what? We're never going to do anything outside of the box. Because if something goes wrong, you're always going to pay a heavy price. It's true. But then you have to weigh the decision. If you're going to have the chairs piled up in such a way where you're asking for trouble, then you deserve it. Then I say this shul deserves it. But if you're conscientious and you say, listen, you know what, 5 extra chairs in this room, few extra chairs over here is not going to upset the apple cart. The city of Long Beach will exist and everybody is still safe, then I don't think it's hurting anybody. It may be going against the spirit of the law, or no, it may be going against the letter of the law. But I don't think in the great big issues it hurts anybody. Now, I'm just saying this is up for debate. I'm saying clearly to the camera, this is not a halachic decision. I'm not Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, and I'm not ruling on this. If this would happen in the shul, okay, it's a case to debate. But I just wanted to bring these cases up because you know what? We think we want to be good citizens, right? We want to be good citizens, and everybody here wants to follow the law. We're not looking to break the law, in any way. But you know what? There are some times in a gray area where you have to make decisions.
I think you made what I consider to be a bit of a false assumption. The city's not going to say there's a limit of 48 people in this room if it's safe to have 60 people in this room. Because they have no reason to just regulate this room to have such a small amount. And then, you know, if we do have a problem here, like say there's a fire, and even one person dies,
Okay.
how would what would happen to your conscience?
Okay, so therefore you have to make it, that's what I'm saying. You reiterated what Paul just said. Paul would said that if you are going to put people in danger and you do something like that, of course I would feel terribly. But if it's a decision based upon practicality and we feel, for example, I'm not saying we're going to do this. I'm just saying theoretically we're talking about this. But I argue with your assumption the city's not going to say 48 was 48. I don't believe that whatsoever. I think the city goes way. You know, we have in this room probably, how many seats does it say over there? 43.
Well, 60 chairs.
Is there? Okay. You know, we're in trouble. You know, we're in trouble. So you know what? You have to weigh it back and forth, and you know. But this, I don't. The hotel set this up. I didn't set this up. As far as I'm concerned, the Schultz only have 43 chairs, you know, in this room, you know, with that. But this is, I just wanted to bring this up. I'm not ruling either way. You know what? If it ever come down to a real debate, we'd have to take a vote, and that's why you have a board, you know, to make it, you know, to do it. But then, you know, these are issues that I'm just saying theoretically come up on a daily basis, just like when you drive down 55. I want to know here, how many people drove 55 when it was 55? Nobody. No, I want to say clearly, I tried to follow this guy. Yesterday I couldn't follow him, forget about it. Not in the Mini Cooper, maybe in the other car. So you ask yourself the same question. If you go 55 on the freeway, you know what you're getting? Beep, beep, you know. You have to, you know, that's, you know. I'm just pointing this out. I'm telling you, drive 35. You know, I don't care. But it's just issues that come up all the time. I brought up 4 or 5 issues just to show you that dina de machus dina, the law of the land is law. Even though you want to be a good citizen, sometimes you're going to come up with issues that are going to challenge on this premise. And you know, how you make a decision, how you make a good decision. Every good decision till something goes wrong, right? Everything's a good decision until something absolutely goes wrong. When it goes wrong, then you look back in hindsight and say, oh, what a mishiganer. You know, what a mishiganer it was, what a mishiganer I was, and you know, all of that stuff. But in the meantime, at least this gives us some food for thought about the next time some of these issues come up.
Back to something from way earlier, you talked about going to the civil, two Jews going to the civil court, not the religious court. What about Jewish people being married in the civil court, and then they split up? Are they still subject to the Jewish laws of divorce?
Oh, that's a very good question. That's a very good question.
It's
a very good question because then we'd have to understand what constitutes a Jewish marriage. What makes a Jewish marriage? A Jewish marriage is made really, in reality, it is a business deal. There's nothing more, nothing less to it. What happens is, you stand under the chuppah, the husband gives the wife the ring. Why does he give her a ring? Because he acquires her. He basically saying, by giving you the ring, I'm taking you into my domain. Then he gives her a ksubah. What does the ksubah say? The ksubah says clearly, it's a one-sided document, that if we have a divorce, it's all on me. What kind of contract is that? No American contract you ever see is one-sided. Crazy. Then they go and they have the third way of actually consummating the marriage is actually consummating the marriage. You know, so in that case, you used to be able to take a girl, say, you know what, I want to marry you, get 2 witnesses, say, follow me, you stand outside the room, I'm in the room with her, we do our thing, married. As long as 2 women, as long as they were there for 8 minutes, and you said you did it, okay? So now, here's a case of a guy who did not give a ring, okay? But he probably over the time lived with her as a common law wife. So it's not so easy to say that they would not need a get. There are many authorities, I would say, because they lived together as husband and wife, and everybody knew that they were husband and wife. And through the time, they did consummate the marriage. I mean, they did live together as a, you know, in all the ways. I mean, he gave her money to buy food. You know, he cared for her. He supported her, and they lived together. Most authorities would say they do need a get, even though they didn't go through a religious marriage. You know, they would still need, because of this. You know, I mean, but of this coil. It's called that. The word on the street is that they're husband and wife. Now, if they just separated,
and then she remarried. Now here would be a difficult case where they separated, she remarried and had a kid. Now, in case of where they had a real religious wedding, let's just say, they had a religious wedding, they separated without a get, she went ahead and had a kid, that kid is what's considered illegitimate. That kid is a mamzer from the viewpoint of the Torah. Here's a case of where two people were living civilly, they had not joined together in a religious ceremony. They then split. She went ahead and she remarried in a religious ceremony and had a kid. That would be a question for authorities to decide whether, what was it enough coil to demand a get? They probably go lenient on that because who wants to have a mamzer running around? We have enough, In Washington. I was going to... You mean now? Oh, after the election? Same thing. Same thing, yeah.
The big mamzers are still there.
The big mamzers are still there with the big M's. The big mamzers are still there. Don't worry, just give it time. That's the greatness of this country. You give it time and every mamzer eventually has his day. You can only be a mamzer for 8 years, thank God. Regardless of which side of the aisle you're on. I mean, it doesn't, it doesn't matter. So here's. Just wanted to bring up. I think we had enough food for thought just to be able to debate in our minds clearly that there are some issues, of course, where it's black and white. There's nothing to talk about. The government prohibits, something from the Torah. We know that the Torah takes precedent. There's rules and regulations in the government where there's no way that you could dance around it. Dina de machus dina. There's no way that you can say, I think that don't pay taxes. Jews have tried that. But you're going to end up in prison. So you know what? There's no reason not to pay taxes because this is a government that's a government generally. It's a government of what we call it's a friendly government to the Jewish people. So there's absolutely no reason not to pay taxes, not to follow the rules and regulations of the dictates of the government. But there are going to be cases which fall into this gray area where people need to make a decision, and there is conscientious objectives, and the government knows about that. There are cases where we, without a question of a doubt, like you all agreed with me with Rosa Parks, that no one would want a prosecutor. You wouldn't want to be the prosecuting attorney on that case because this was clearly a case of discrimination. And then there are other cases which are a little less clear that one has to debate. I mean, like for example, now if a guy doesn't want to go to Iraq, I mean, this is not such an easy, clear-cut case. If a soldier went into the army with the understanding that he follows orders, and and now they ask you to go to Iraq, and you find it's an illegitimate war. Why do you want to go to Iraq and kill innocent people? That you feel it's not so easy. It's not, okay, so they put you in jail, and you spend a harsh time, doing that. So. Thank God we live in a democracy where you can still protest and you don't end up in a gulag in Siberia. Any questions? So let's go out there. And, I'm feeling a little pain on my side. Is there? No. Let's get some. All right. Enough. Well, yeah. I wasn't going to say it, but all right. I think.